Effective immediately, I'm a vegetarian, and I am fucking scared of him. Hi, hello, how's it going? It's Lo. I read a book that people were talking about, and now I'm going to talk about because I haven't been able to eat meat since, and I'm going to make it everyone else's problem. This week, we're going to discuss Tender is the Flesh by Agustina Basterrica. I think that's how you say her name. Basterrica. Basterrica. That's a very unusual name, I will say. This book became very popular because it's a dystopian novel that's making everyone who reads it very grossed out, and with very good reason. In Tender is the Flesh, we're dwelling into a futuristic society where animals and contact with any animals becomes dangerous and poisonous to humans. And so instead of going vegans, humans decided that it was a good time to try cannibalism. Yeah, I feel like this is God punishing me for all my cannibalism talk, but this is different. That was different. I swear that was different. This is basically like, this book is the book version of, you know those PETA ads where they put humans in packages of like animal meat? It's supposed to be shocking and stuff. Yeah, it means like this book is something like that, but like 1,000 times grosser. She goes really into detail about how like the slaughter process is done, and it's not good. It's so disgusting. I think that some of you may be getting the impression that this is a rent review. It truly isn't, sort of. But it isn't. I actually enjoyed the book. It's just disgusting. There are things that I disliked about this book, and we're going to talk about it, but this book really explores two themes that I think we should also discuss, and that is abjection and what it means to be a human. Both these themes I actually talked about before, and I want to see how they relate to this book in particular. Wait, no, abjection I actually talked on my Babel video, which hasn't gone up yet because HarperCollins is being a fucking So this one is going to go up first because this book is Simon & Schuster, and Babel is going to come up when HarperCollins finally gets his head out of its ass and offers a fair deal to its employees. The point is, I wrote about abjection and what it means to be human in my thesis. I need someone to talk about it. So, lucky you. Am I right? So to discuss Tender is the Flesh, as always, we're going to go through a couple of main topics. First, we're going to go into an in-depth look about abjection and what it means to be horrified in this book. Then we're going to look into an exploration of what it means to be human. And then we're going to critique a little bit both of capitalism and colonialism, but also the whiteness of this book, because this book was written by a white Argentinian. And it shows. No shade to Argentinians. You know what, actually, full shade to Argentinians. I'm Brazilian and I'm very bitter about the World Cup. But anyway, let's start with the synopsis proper, shall we? Working at the local processing plant, Marcos is in the business of slaughtering humans, though no one calls them that anymore. His wife has left him, his father is sinking into dementia, and Marcos tries not to think too hard about how he makes a living. After all, it happened so quickly. First, it was reported that an infectious virus had made all animal meat poisonous to humans. Then government started the transition. Now, eating human meat, special meat, is legal. Marcos tries to stick to numbers, consignments, and processing. Then one day he's given a gift, a live specimen of the finest quality. Though he's aware that any form of personal contact is forbidden on pain of death, little by little he starts to treat her like a human being, and soon he becomes tortured by what has been lost and what might still be saved. That doesn't begin to cover this book, but anyways. First things first, let's go through my general impressions of the book. This book is disturbing and this book is disgusting. That's it. See you next time. Bye. I don't even know where to begin to trigger warn this, because when we start a book right off the bat with cannibalism, I feel like it doesn't really get much worse than that, but it does have some non-con elements and it's really disturbing, so I will be warned on that. Listen, if you felt physically sick watching the franchise Saw, then I'm gonna go ahead and tell you that this is not gonna be your cup of tea, because the worst provider of images that you can have is your own brain. And this book is like, your brain is against you in this one. It's you by yourself. My brain decided that it was going to make this book so much worse, and thus I haven't been able to eat meat for a while now since finishing this book, so yeah. All jokes aside, this is truly not a book for everyone. If you like horror, if you like body horror, you're gonna like this. It's very clinical in the way that it's written, but almost like a detachment from the horrors that are on page. And that I think is significant for the story itself, but we're gonna get there. But I really just cannot stress just how disturbing this book is. I tried to record at a time that the sun wouldn't be so much on my face, and now the sun is completely on my face. Ugh. If I squint, it's because I'm trying not to burn my eyeballs. This book really stresses the conversation that we had with Zodiac Academy, which is like, should we be able to one-star a book just because it deals with a taboo topic? And the answer is still no. I one-starred Zodiac Academy because it was fucking ridiculous. But Tender is the Flesh treats the subject matter very seriously, and although there are a couple of holes in the world building that I could identify. She says animals would chase into extinction because they became dangerous to humans, but that is possibly impossible. That is impossible to do without literally destroying the entire planet. So you do have to sort of hold tight to your suspension of disbelief with this one and take what she's saying sort of at face value and go like, yeah, okay, I'll buy it. Pun not intended, by the way. I didn't mean that. But yeah, my general impressions of the book aside, let's talk about abjection. There is this author called Julia Kristeva who wrote a book called Powers of Horror, where she develops this idea of abjection within psychoanalysis. Again, and as always, we're going to look at psychoanalysis as something that is part of philosophy and not necessarily a psychology thing, because I really am not going to argue with you which one is the best clinical approach. I know psychologists like to do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a lawyer. I just like philosophy. That's just it. You do you. Go into therapy. Whatever therapy that you found works best for you is the one that I suggest you stick to it. There's this psychoanalyst called Lacan, and he talks about the mirror stage, where the infant will look at a mirror and realize that the person that he's seeing in the mirror is not only a separate person, but are themselves. So when you're a kid, you look at a mirror, and at first you can't recognize it. But eventually, as you become older, you look at the mirror and you go, oh, that's a different person than my mom or my dad. That's a separate human being. That's an individual. And that individual is me. This is what he says is a breaking moment between the self and the caretakers, because up until that moment, the self doesn't really identify itself as different than the caretakers. So you're not really aware that you're not your mom until you're about 1.5 years old. I know, disturbing. Let me make it more disturbing. Because Julia Kristeva gets this idea and goes even further. She says that before mirror stage can even happen, there's this thing called abjection, a sense of abjection that needs to be instilled into you in order for this differentiation to happen. Because abjection, she says, will be the guardian of individuality. Abjection is that visceral reaction to things that sort of remind you of when you were not an individual, but rather this mess of needs that were answered without you ever needing to voice them. So abjection, she says, need to be developed before the mirror stage so that when the mirror stage happens and you are confronted with the fact that you are your own person, you can have this innate psychological reaction that is this innate psychological refusal of being something else. And so your body is trying to protect yourself against things that might put you in a position where your sense of individuality is being threatened. So abjection, it's that involuntary reaction. It's not just disgust. It's like that that you get, you know, when you see certain textures, certain sights, certain smells. Like, imagine one day that you open your kitchen trash and it's just full of maggots. And then one falls on your foot. God, I fucking hate maggots. Oh my God. This reaction that you would have, like this maybe vomiting a little bit in your mouth, that's abjection. And this abjection, like I said, serves a purpose, because the purpose of this is to push you away from everything that might collapse your sense of self. So again, let's bring it back. Abjection is the reaction that you need to develop before you differentiate yourselves from your caretakers, because the baby, and you begin to have this, you begin to be disgusted by things that remind you of how dependent you are on other people to survive. So you have a visceral reaction to things that will somehow trigger your subconscious into being reminded that you are inherently vulnerable as a person. Keep that in mind. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. So that disgust comes from a place where somehow in your subconscious, you feel threatened in your sense of individuality. And you have this reaction where you immediately recoil from that thing. You push away from that thing. You go like, no, absolutely not. And then the danger of threatening your sense of individuality is somehow averted because you pulled yourself away from that situation. And so this is what abjection really means. And so what is the problem with abjection? Abjection is not just something that happens within a specific moment. Abjection is something that is always a threat because there's always a threat to your sense of individuality when you're walking around the world. And so abjection is terrifying, that sense of disgust that is terrifying because it's a constant reminder of what you push aside, the information that you push aside, the fact that you're inherently vulnerable in order to survive as your own individual self. And I explained this in my thesis as follows. Certain foods, smell, taste, textures will activate a certain irrational reaction of our biology that makes us recoil violently from the offending object. Certain animals and insects will provoke a virulent reaction that seems to come from the deepest layers of our guts, which shrivel away, goosebumps raising the surface of our skin. This reaction, albeit involuntary and seemingly innate to our biology, is nonetheless explained by Kristeva as pertaining to abjection. It is important to clarify here that the skin of the milk or any other source of abjection does not signify the space of rejection, but rather, and as with every other thing that might elicit a violent reaction of disgust, shows us what we permanently thrust aside in order to live. Feces, excrements, maggots, certain textures, and certain smells reminds us of that border of our own subjectivity, one that must be violently expelled if we are to remain living. So this is why we're so disgusted by cannibalism, because cannibalism in our society is the ultimate violation of your individuality. It's when you consume someone else to the point of non-existence, it becomes disgusting because it reminds us that in the end, despite our best efforts, we're still a pound of flesh, and that we're not so different from animals, and that we can be eaten just as animals are. And so tender is the flesh is not disgusting because capitalism is also disgusting, but we're going to talk about that in a second. Tender is the flesh, like I was saying, is disgusting not just because cannibalism in itself is disgusting. We need to look at disgust a little bit more closely because disgust is also political. Cannibalism is disgusting because it attacks our sense of self. It attacks our sense of boundaries. Think of the act of eating, right? You put things in your body and your body will absorb them. And so when we say you are what you eat, we're sort of right in that assessment because when your body absorbs a little bit of the eggplant, of the chicken that you ate, you sort of become that food in a sense. And so if you absorb everything that you consume and you consume someone else, you become someone else a little. And the boundaries between you and that person get a little blurred. And so where is your individuality in that? On the other hand, the reason why this is so disturbing, and like I said, everything is political. Cannibalism is political. There are societies where ritual cannibalism is practiced because this idea of becoming someone else a little by consuming them is an idea that isn't disgusting for them. But it is disgusting for us because it threatens what we would understand as our sense of individuality within this society that we inhabit. In the ways that we were brought up and in our society as we know it today, cannibalism is one of the most fundamental of violations because when you're consuming someone else who ceases to exist, ceases to be human, you almost become like a chimera of someone else and your own sense of individuality is being threatened. On the other hand, to be consumed means that your entire individuality is gone. And this is why we're so scared of cannibalism. We're like, this could be me. This person being eaten could be me. And it could be my individuality that is gone. It could be my sense of self that is gone. I could be so thoroughly destroyed like that because cannibalism destroys the original source of that person. To consume someone else within our framework of our society, you must first dehumanize them to an extent that consuming them does not form a threat to your own sense of individuality. And then we get to my second point, which is the humanity by recognition and what it means to be human. Judith Butler develops this when she talks about precarious lives. In her view, we're precarious of two ways. One, because we're human, and the other one, because there is an unequal allocation of precariousness in the world. So of the first way that we as humans, we are inherently precarious, she says the following. I am referring to violence, vulnerability, and mourning, but there is a more general conception of the human with which I am trying to work here. One in which we are, from the start, given over to the other. One in which we are from the start, even prior to individuation itself, and by virtue of bodily requirements, given over to some set of primary others. This conception means that we are vulnerable to those we are too young to know and to judge, hence vulnerable to violence, but also vulnerable to another range of touch, a range that includes the eradication of our being on one end and the physical support of our lives at the other. What does this mean? Her idea of being a human is born out of relationality. I am a human because you recognize me as a human. You recognize me as a human being worthy of being cared for, a human being with needs, a human being you cannot strike because you might fear that I'm going to strike you back and then I'm going to threaten your own sense of self. We'll live in this sort of permanent state of I am human because I recognize you as human. And that recognition implies that I recognize that you are a creature with needs and whose needs need to be fulfilled in some way. And you are a creature who is not immune to violence. But that also implies that I recognize that I'm a creature with needs that need to be met, and needs that need other people to be met. And I'm also a creature that is not immune to violence. And so if I know that you can cause me harm and you know that I can cause you harm, we're sort of stuck in this precarious arrangement where we respect each other and we see each other as humans because we are aware that we need each other at the same time that we fear each other. We recognize the inherent vulnerability of being one another, and that is why being human is inherently being precarious. Because, again, this precariousness is not evenly allotted. Not everyone is precarious in the same way. Every time someone strikes you or is violent against you, or it's because that person thinks that they don't need you, that you're not able to strike back, that you're not human, you're less than human, and therefore they're justified and allowed to do this harm to you. And this is why oppression is dehumanizing, because oppression is allotting the ways in which people will be seen as less than human. And so for this reason, Butler will say, to the extent that we commit violence, we're acting on another, putting the other at risk, causing the other damage, threatening to expunge the other. In a way, we all live with this particular vulnerability, a vulnerability to the other that is part of bodily life, a vulnerability to a sudden address from elsewhere that we cannot preempt. This vulnerability, however, becomes highly exacerbated under certain social and political conditions, especially those in which violence is a way of life and the means to secure self-defense are limited. She goes on to explain grief and how grief is political. What I want to point out here is that when we're talking about recognizing death, means that we're recognizing that break in that recognition tie. If I need you to recognize me as a human in order for me to be a human, then if you die, that part of you that recognized me as a human dies with you. And so it's like I lose a little bit of myself. I lose a little bit of my humanity whenever someone else dies and takes with them the possibility of recognizing me as a person. This is why we grieve. But if someone who I don't see as a human dies, that means nothing to me. So I don't grieve. And to explain that, she will actually say the following. There are no obituaries for the war causalities that the United States inflicts, and there cannot be. If there were to be an obituary, there would have to have been a life worth noting, a life worth valuing and preserving, a life that qualifies for recognition. Although we might argue that it would be impractical to write obituaries for all those people or for all people, I think we have to ask again and again how the obituary functions as the instrument by which grievability is publicly distributed. If it is the means by which a life becomes or fails to become a publicly grievable life, an icon for national self-recognition, the means by which a life becomes noteworthy. As a result, we have to consider the obituary as an act of nation building. The matter is not a simple one. For if a life is not grievable, it is not quite a life. It does not qualify as a life and is not worth a note. It is already the unburied, if not the unbearable. Why did I just say all of this? Tender is the Flesh is not only disturbing because cannibalism in its inception as a source of abjection is disturbing. Tender is the flesh is disturbing because it makes us identify with the meat that is ready for slaughter, and to be afraid for our humanity to be so thoroughly disregarded and so invalidated and so thoroughly and completely destroyed that we're nothing but a source of food to others, a food that would cause no harm and whose death will not be mourned, and a complete shattering of our sense of identity and a complete shattering of the recognition ties that hold us to our humanity. It's like we're not even human. We're so afraid because this book highlights that our vulnerability is inherent to our humanity and it can be easily exploited. And that our deaths won't mean a thing, and that our deaths won't even be a death because there is no life to speak of. And it's very clear in the book, and it's very interesting how the law and the state and the government is involved in determining that certain people are not people, that certain people are not supposed to be seen as human. The state determines that this specific meat is not human, these specific subset of people are not human, and everybody is supposed to go along with it or die themselves. There's a whole debate here on just how the state maintains lives who are not quite lives, lives who are being able to be destroyed, lives that are able to be violence, are able to be harmed without any further consequences. You just need to think about police brutality. And this is what fucks people up. This is what makes people think that this book is disgusting, me myself included. Because every time that she describes how the meat is slaughtered with such detachment, it's like she described how we're so slaughtered clinically in society as we know it. How our humanity is so consistently disregarded that if we try just a little bit harder, this is the state that we can go, because we're consistently losing our humanity through this unequal allocation of precariousness, through this oppression that makes us less than human, and through government and state apparatus that makes us be less than human through the force of the law. And that the fact that our humanity is so consistently disregarded is horrifying to people, especially people who have never been aware or acutely aware of how this is done. And so if you're a person who is not keenly aware of the privileges that you have to be recognized, fully recognized as a human, this book is going to be very disturbing, because it's going to be like, what, but I can be that? I can be that meat? I can't be that meat. That is the reaction that this book wants to elicit. Because there is a critique that you can make here. It's a very PETA critique, and I hate PETA, so I'm not gonna go there. Because the vegans are the vegans. I'm not gonna go there. But there's another critique here, and I will have to say this one, because this book is an allegory to how bodies are treated within capitalism. Certain bodies are to be consumed, worked to death, bled dry, just so a certain subset of people can continue to live life with comfort. And more importantly, and I think that this is a flaw of the book really, because it really doesn't go in depth about the question of who can be eaten, what can be eaten. It's interesting that right at the beginning it says that it began with Bolivian immigrants, and so it highlights the marginality and the precarity of where this began, but it really doesn't go much deeper into that, and I wish that it would. And this is interesting to me that this book was written by an Argentinian author, because the meat industry in Argentina is huge. I don't want to give props to Argentina for literally anything, but I will have to admit that they snap with chimichurri sauce. Begrudgingly, Argentina snapped with chimichurri sauce. Anyway, but this universe is very interesting because the Argentinian meat industry is so strong. In this universe, we would have once again what we already have in society as we know it, which is bodies of the South being consumed to keep the standards of living of the North. The disgusting nature of this is not seen just by those who consume the meat, and she does say all the time that the best meat is the meat for exportation. And even the local elites don't get the finest of cuts. The best meat is always for abroad. It's always to be exported. And this is what happens with the meat industry, both in Argentina, but also in Brazil. The best cuts of meat are always for exportation. They don't stay in Brazil or Argentina in that case. But in this case, we're literally killing bodies here to keep the North fed. We're burning bodies here so that the North won't ever feel the need to stop eating meat, despite the global collapse that just happened. So this book is very clearly saying that We in the South are being eaten to keep the North afloat, and no one is batting an eye. Just how this book describes everything so clinically. Um, Everything that is done to us is always described so clinically, and no one really gives a shit because it's easy for you when you don't see that and you just receive the packaged final product. It's easy for you to try to be detached from that reality, for you to try to be detached from the reality of exploitation, when in fact what you're receiving when you received your orange juice, when you receive your sugar, you receive your coffee, you're receiving bits and pieces of the people who died to make sure that that went to your table. And so I wish that this book had dwelled a lot deeper into this aspect, because then I would have given it 5 stars. It would have been absolutely genius. Because here's the thing, I think that the true horror of Tender is the Flesh is not just cannibalism, it's not just realizing that you can be eaten, that your life is precarious. The real horror here is realizing that you have been eating people all along, and that you never realized that your comfort and your way of life actively demands other people's blood. But that being said, this is a book written by a white Argentinian, and it really shows. The reason why it shows is because it's very callous in the way that the criticism on slavery is done. Here's how she talks about it. Owning slaves is prohibited. He remembers the allegations against a family that was prosecuted for keeping 10 female slaves in a clandestine workshop. They were branded. The family had bought them from a breeding center and trained them. They'd all been taken to the municipal slaughterhouse. The females and the family became special meat. The press reported on the case for weeks. He remembers that there was a sentence that everyone repeated, horrified. Slavery is barbaric. That is supposed to be, very condescending on the working conditions of the South and how, you can eat people and you can kill people, but slavery suddenly is too much. But I think that this was very callous in the way that it was done. It was very disturbing for me to read it because it seemed a lot like certain ads or certain writings that I'd seen people do on slaves in colonial Brazil. And I think that this should have been done in a way that is not so, how do I put this? It shouldn't have been so callous in the way that it described things, because then it tends to repeat language that was used on slaves. And as a Brazilian, that is very disturbing to read. And so I think that this was a disturbance that was not a good type of disturbing. It wasn't a thought-provoking type of disturbing. It was just very strange to listen to people being talked like that. I understand what she was trying to do, but I think it was done callously. And I didn't like how it was treated because it was never brought up again. It was never once considered, never talked how this was the language that was used on slaves, and the how it's hypocritical of people to be like slavery is bad, but they're using the same language that was used on slavery. That was never really discussed. And I wish that it would, because then it would have added a lot more depth to the book. There's a way for you to make this critique without evoking chattel slavery, and I don't think that she succeeded in it. This is why I was saying that this book was very clearly written by a white Argentinian, because the critique of colonialism and capitalism, A+, excellent, good. Race, non-existent. Race never factors a thing in this, and it's supposed to, because if we're talking about who is going to be eaten, bodies of color are going to be eaten first. And this is not something that you can just put behind yourself. So racist never really factors into this, really, and only really when it does. There is a very slightly racist portrayal of a Japanese man, by the way. And I feel like this comes from a collective lack of self-awareness of racism when it comes to white Argentinians, which is why every time that they have a minor nuisance, they are eager to call us over here in Brazil monkeys. It's a good time, except not really. So I think that this book kind of highlights Argentina's issues with race and how race factors into critical thinking in Argentina, because Argentina had black people and it doesn't have that many black people anymore. And the story of how they don't have that many black people anymore is not a story that Argentinians are going to be proud of telling. Argentinians, don't kill me. You guys have the World Cup already. I am entitled to some criticism. I was also called a monkey many times during the America's Cup. So this is payback. Anyway, Tender is the Flesh is a very layered and complex book that I feel like I could sit here and talk about for ages. There's just so much to explore in this in this universe that was created by Augustina Baxter-Rica. I'll be thinking about it for a very long time, despite giving it only 3.5 stars. I think it was an interesting idea with a lukewarm execution. The execution could have been done better. But it's one that even still raises some very interesting questions. And the discussions that can be had on Tender is the Flesh are endlessly, really. We can talk about the purpose of the government of creating those bodies that are less than human enough to be eaten. We can talk about just so much that this book gives us the sort of the leeway to discuss. But those are the topics that I wanted to discuss today. As always, if you like this video, you can leave me a coffee on Ko-fi, where you can also find information for commissioning me, for reviews, for beta readings and sensitivity readings. You can also follow me on Patreon to have early access to videos and many other perks like cat pictures. And yeah, this was today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed all this rambling, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!